How we doing today, everybody? Today is Friday. Not working, all blends together. I've been fairly obsessed with making these jazz trading cards. I go up to 234 fronts I've made, and 400 is not going to do it. 400 is still going to leave a lot of people out. And what you don't realize when you start is that if you're going to do 70, 80 sax players and 50, 60 trumpet players and 70, 80 of the great piano players from the 20s to 1970, those numbers are going to add up. And then you got to throw in 20, 30 bass players and drummers and vibraphonists and organists and some of the obscure, weird one-off things like harps and French horns and some singers, some band leaders. It's all, it's sprawling, but it's fun. I'm learning stuff doing it, and I know y'all will learn stuff too. The issue I'm having is I'm getting some people saying, you gotta be careful putting this stuff out there without licensing or without permission. I'll be honest, I don't have the first clue how to start getting the permission to use someone's photograph. I don't have a clue. Never had to do anything like that before. Is it a difficult process or is it a long drawn out process? I have no idea. But I think we'll start, as I get this series further produced, you know, I'll put some out there digitally, I think, just on the channel, as I figure out what I'm going to do with them in a more physical sense. It's I got a few people I want to talk to. I'm just waiting to hear back from a couple folks. A few folks I've heard have urged me to be cautious. At the same time, we're a pretty small channel, and we're not selling them. We're not looking to make a profit. If you're the owner of a jazz photograph of any kind and you objected to what we're doing with this, you're not really caring about jazz. You watch my channel for a few episodes and you know jazz is the only focus. It's not about making money. I'm not going to sell them. They'll be purely promotional. Again, I'm going to try to give them to people who do support the channel, but that's not a one-to-one thing. That being said, I think there needs to be some kind of a precedent where if you want these cards, I need to be able to say, well, this guy's been a channel subscriber for a long time. He's not paying 1 month for a Patreon subscription and wants the cards. He's been there at least 3 months. So if you want these cards, I would recommend signing up for Patreon sooner rather than later as we figure out and navigate this. But like I said, I've got 234 of the fronts made. And I want to put together a little video just kind of rolling through them. But that would slow me down from making them. And I'm having so much fun doing that. But we're digging into some deep cats, man. Freddie Keppard, you know, early guys like that. Kid Ory. We're digging into a lot of the, you know, I'm giving some of the avant-garde guys. I'm giving you some of the real swing cats, more of the swing bands, the band leaders, and the great soloists from those bands who all end up in the series that we're about to talk about. And that's Swingville. And we did Moodsville about a month ago. And I didn't want to do Swingville because I was missing a few records. It took about 3 weeks for those records to show up in the mail. And I had forgotten that one of the 2 Jimmy Hamilton records here, I never got the cover with it when I bought it. I didn't realize that at the time when I bought it, that it was missing the cover. It was probably a part of a large bundle of stuff I grabbed and I didn't notice the cover was missing. So I don't have the cover for that one, but I'll probably put a picture of the cover up if I remember. If not, you can Google it. But I had the record, which is what matters. But and Hamilton's one of the great players of the Ellington group, just a fiery player on that clarinet. But I love his records on Everest too. He makes Jimmy Hamilton on Urania. He makes some serious stuff. But the swing era was such a prolific era, and truly what we remember now was kind of the cream of the crop, and the ones that have stood the test of time and been filtered through the bottleneck of history. History definitely will take out the peripheral and the copycats and the imitators, and you'll end up being left with the essential elements of the swing age. And you can almost kind of boil it down to a few guys, you know, Basie, Ellington, Goodman. I love Charlie Barnett. The Dorsey brothers had a real big impact. Artie Shaw was a big guy. You know, there's a few other cats that you'll see in the series when the cards come out. But the swing era had a lot of fun going on, but it also led to a lot more structure from the charts in terms of what guys could play and how long their breaks were going to be. And you spent a lot of time in the ensemble creating movements of sound with the horn section, with the brass, with the reeds, doing counterbalances, counter melody, and doing differing melody, counter melodies and stuff. The swing era was very interesting that way. I hear a lot of that sound stuff and dubstep and some of the modern music of today in the dance clubs, even some of the same principles. They didn't have modern technology to make this music back then. So the music they made that had that swell and that move and that groove and that feel and those chunks of sound and open room and that same repetition chunk of sound and then the open room. Think of music as that. It's like a block of elements, then there's space. Then that same block of elements, then there's space. And swing has that principle happening. The art of the groove, Basie with his minimal piano part that lets a simple riff of saxophones on top of it, and the drum and the bass are swinging along with Basie, and the trumpets come in, and then you give that trumpet player on the second chair that big break, and he goes, and then the sax player leader comes up and he responds, and you pick different players for different pieces that fit each song's personality the best. And Ellington was often given credit for having writing pieces to his songs with certain players in his band in mind. This is Russell Procope here, but I'm writing this one here for Rabbit, Johnny Hodges, and then we're going to give this one over here to Ben Webster. So when you have certain guys' sound in your ear, and this guy's tonality is going to be, that's going to be perfect. If I have all these oboes and clarinets and a flutes over here going, kind of doing that, and this guy comes in with that smooth tenor sax over here, that's going to be fun. But all the same, it left a lot of these guys wanting to stretch out, and part of that restlessness at the heart of the matter was what fused Charlie Parker into trying new things and delving into bebop, because the limitations of the big bands. And the big bands had become a money-making machine. They were, especially the white bands, but even the black bands were doing really well, even during the Depression. And then during the war years, swing music helps keep America alive. And the armies are waiting for those new V-discs of jazz music to come out and help keep those kids excited over there in the trenches. Well, not really trenches in the Second World War so much, but I was saying it was the essence of the music that back home. And there was a lot of white replication of black music in swing music. And that's true with hip-hop, it's true with bebop, it's true with almost every aspect of black music. There's white replication that the average white kid can feel a little more comfortable bringing home to their mom and dad in 1964 than you were to bring home the real facsimile. But you listened to the real thing when you could, but you brought home the whiter, safer version for mom and dad. And we forget here in our tower and glass crystal windows nowadays how risky and dangerous it was being Ray Charles. We think Ray Charles, that's some safe, easy music that's not dangerous. But Ray upset the apple cart. The church was furious with that secular encapsulation of the spiritual. And the spiritual and the sexual in R&B are ever interwoven. Marvin Gaye, Al Green, it's always that duality of what am I saying I love? What is it I really keep coming back for and I can't stay away from? Is it the church or is it that sweet jelly roll? And it's easy to lose that line, but it's meant to be blurred intentionally. And that's the clever double entendre of rhythm and blues that leaks over into rock and roll. Little Richard and Elvis Presley, all the way through to the present, there's always been that kind of duality. What makes Nicki Minaj and Cardi B less essential is some of the subtlety and nuance of the double meaning has been lost, and we're just now saying straight up, almost just gross. And I'm not a prude. I don't mind any kind of sexual lingo. I think repressing sexuality is the most damaging thing in society. I think it's caused so much more trouble than anything else. You keep us unhappy and restricted, and we keep chomping at the bit for something, and it fuels the religion, it fuels addiction, it fuels commercialization. That unsatisfaction keeps a lot of us spending. We can't put a finger on it because it's been regulated since birth, so we just have this shame and sex is just for marriage. The regulation of that's such a non-animalistic experience. No other creature walks away from sex feeling shameful about it, ashamed of their own nudity. It's a real trouble. But black music has always pulsed with that double edge of sexuality and spirituality, and it was risky. But as Parker makes these innovations and the swing era comes to a screeching halt because rhythm and blues, rock and roll are taking off. The post-war is different. Jazz has now cutting-edge bebop that you can't dance to it. It's, you can if you have a beret. And a beret, people don't know this, but a beret often turns into a monocle. You just got to give it a few years, and that will just kind of morph itself into some very pompous poshosity. It's a wonderful thing, darling. Marvelous. But yeah, I can dance to Parker Watch. But it's not danceable. And the black community was the first people to say it and didn't buy it for the most part. So that being said, as the jazz age kind of comes to a screeching halt, and commercially it does. In the 40s, it was a large chunk of the American record market sales. By 1950, by 1960, it's become microscopic. And so all these legends that we speak of in the jazz age from 55 to 60, in spite of how popular we think they are in our rose-tinted lenses looking back, there wasn't a lot of jazz that sold well. Miles Davis records sold really well when they sold to the tune of a couple 100,000 copies, and that was the pinnacle. A few of them would do a little better than that. Miles Davis records always didn't even hit that 100,000 mark. Brubeck, those records were the exception. Hello Dolly Armstrong was a popular record. Those records were the exception. Most jazz existed in great obscurity. 50s Blue Note doesn't have a presence nationally. All those great 50s Blue Note records, that's a very, very regional thing, and I've talked about that many times. And there was no distribution even for those small labels nationally. And they've since become distributed nationally as those labels got bought out by bigger and bigger labels. And so we had those records in the marketplace around the nation throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which is what most of those pressings are going to be, which is what makes the originals so expensive and hard to find. And that's same for all those great little labels from both coasts. The white labels had better distribution and higher sales, so they're less expensive and easier to find. Makes sense. Impulse, Verve were backed by big corporations and had great distribution. They're less expensive, easier to find. Even Emerson Mercury, their ascendancy was so rapid, and they opened that second plant in Chicago, that Mercury Emerson stuff got fairly good distribution, going back even in the late 50s. So they're not expensive, easier to find. But those little small labels that just stayed in a region and faded away or got bought out quickly, those originals are pretty impossible to come by. So jazz really starts to lose its footing. The swing bands couldn't afford to be on the road. Even the great swing bands had to hang it up for a while. Basie's doing his 7-piece group, which is some outstanding stuff. Ellington pars down his groups at times, takes it off the road at times. It was tough times. And it led to a lot of the swing era giants not working much. And I've talked before about Norman Granz over at Verve, signs a lot of those greats up and gives them work in the 50s. And while he's in control of Verve before Creed Taylor comes over, he gives work to all those greats. And a lot of them were guys that came into the early eras of bebop too, like Parker, like Dizzy, like Sonny Stitt. He's giving work to those guys as well. Those guys who didn't sell really great, and then when they're at Verve, they're not really doing that experimental bebop stuff that they were doing at Dial and Savoy. Some of those other labels didn't really have much oversight. They were doing more commercially viable stuff. So you have a lot of these swing cats being pared down into smaller groups, making fairly accessible music. And into that fray jumps Prestige, which is a small label, probably bigger than Blue Note. They established themselves a little sooner than Blue Note. I think their 10-inch era had more name artists, and more original recording material. Some of the Blue Note 10-inch stuff is actually stuff they licensed from live recordings, European releases they give American releases to on Blue Note, but they weren't Blue Note recordings. Prestige was a little bit more independent early on, had bigger names early on. Miles Davis, of course, even though Miles wasn't a big name at that point, was part of that whole charge. And Prestige starts recording some of these great swing era cats. Coleman Hawkins, for example. And they released some of it in the 7000 series, but as jazz starts to change commercially, and the new jazz imprint gets the more experimental prestige stuff that merges on, the avant-garde and has some experimental aspects to it. Weinstock puts that stuff on new jazz imprint, starting in 58, 59, and a 60. He's still putting some of those swing cats on Prestige 7000 series, but they don't really fit with what else is there. Coltrane, Miles, Sonny Rollins, Monk, and then he wants to find a different place. And I'm guessing, I'm not sure on this, but I'm guessing he actually started having a backlog of some of these swing guys' sessions that they're tracking and needs an outlet for it. And thus, Prestige, Moodsville, and Swingville were born. And they're great recordings by some of the greatest players ever. And if I remember, they were also slightly cheaper than their Prestige counterparts. So they were, they were given kind of regular ass designs early on. I think the first 10 Prestige and first 10 Moodsville both had kind of just a real simple stencil that they changed the color and the photos in. But Prestige jumps in with Swingville with this number 2001, Coleman Hawkins with the Red Garland Trio. And if I remember, the bass player Doug Watkins is on this. Yeah, it was Specs Wright, great drummer, was a great record on Roulette, and then Red Garland with Coleman Hawkins. So just a great lineup. And you hear Coleman with all that tonality and years of wisdom and experience, just relishing this chance to be kind of the solo star of the show. And Garland will take his little breaks, but the rhythm section is not going to really do too much demanding his space, so Coleman gets to really stretch out. And these are just fun records. I'm going to back that up a little bit. Coleman on a ballad, wonderful. Just the side of Ben Webster in terms of his dreaminess, and Webster has that real whisper to his tonality that makes Webster really special. But this is 2001, first one, fantastic stuff. Number 2, the great Tiny Grimes, 2002. Tiny Grimes is a great guitar player. He was on King Records for a while, kind of a blues, R&B, jazz crossover guy, and he learns to play the banjo first, if I recall, and then he ends up playing the tenor guitar, which is just a 4-string guitar missing the 2 highest strings. And he brings a real sense of guttural, earthy blues to anything he's on. I'm a big fan of Tiny Grimes. His record on United Artists is outstanding. Everything he does here on Prestige is really great. And I love his King stuff too. Tough to come by though. So yeah, I love Tiny Grimes and what he brought to the table. And he's playing with Jerome Richardson here, which Jerome is one of those great unheralded giants of jazz. And in my trading card series, I'm trying to put people like Jerome in. A guy who only makes a half dozen records as a leader, but he's on 200 sessions. Like when you look at Jerome Richardson's list on Wikipedia of all his side work, there's a lot of incredibly great records on that list. And he's got to be part of that formula. He shows up on way too many great records for he not to be part of that formula. You gotta love Jerome Richardson. I just found his record on United Artists recently. Tough to come by. Buddy Tate, fantastic player. Another one of those Texas Tenorman guys. Plays a lot of blues. The Texas Tenorman, from what most of them anyway, starting with Illinois Jackett, who starts that. He starts to play with an oversized reed. So if you play tenor, you play with a baritone reed. If you play alto, you play with a tenor reed. You play soprano, you play with an alto reed. And it gives it a kind of a thicker, warmer, fuzzier sound that just somehow warms the cockle shells. And Buddy Tate is another one of those guys that has kind of slipped through the cracks, and in today's collectors aren't too concerned about, sadly. Tiny Grimes, once again, 2004, with Lockjaw Davis and J.C. Higginbottom. And, of course, Lockjaw is an institution of swing meeting the blues, meeting the black church, you know. And a lot of these guys have Basie alumni in them, some Ellington alumni as well. But it's just the black who's who of the swing era. And I want to be very clear on something. Very, very few of these records in the Swingville series are actually swing music. And I think that's why people don't buy them. They think, oh, these are recordings from the 30s of the great swing bands. I'm not really ready for that. And it's not that. It's guys from that swing era, now in the modern era, where they're in a pared down situation, showing you their skill set, playing the Great American Songbook in the most beautiful and wonderful setting. Some of Prestige's greatest recordings are in Moodsville and Swingsville, and people overlook them. You know, they're also interested in that Monk and the Rollins, and for rightfully so, those great records by great artists. But these records aren't just dated recordings from 2 decades before. That's not the case. They're all new recordings, and generally in settings that went from a 17-piece big band back in the day. Now it's just being a trio or quartet setting. And you really get to know a player when they have that much space to talk to you. It's basically like if I'm interviewing a room of 18 people, I get to know a little bit about everyone. I don't really get to know anyone really well. If I get to see you just one-on-one with Coleman Hawkins for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to get to feel something. I might know a little something about you when it's just you stretching out maybe one other player. And that's one of the great things about this series. OJC does reissue quite a few, but a lot of them didn't get reissued by OJC, which OJC, Prestige, and Riverside, stuff that doesn't get reissued, stuff from Prestige and Riverside that didn't get reissued on OJC is how I should say it. That stuff slipped into obscurity. The stuff that OJC does reissue kind of kept those records in the public eye. They saw them in the record stores. They kind of stayed, and a lot of them were the better titles by the better artists. But the more obscure in between the cracks stuff, that stuff OJC didn't reissue it. And those titles are all the ones that are harder to find, and they're all the ones that you're going to be like, oh, I've never seen that before when you do see it. This is Coleman Hawkins again with Joe Thomas and Vic Dickinson. OJC 2005. We already talked about Coleman, so we're going to move along. The Happy Jazz of Rex Stewart, a great trumpet player, plays with Ellington. He might have played with Basie for a while too, if I think about it. 2006. And Rex is a fiery player in the kind of Roy Eldridge school, Armstrong school. A lot of bravado and big sounds. And again, you're not getting swing. You're getting small group ensemble emoting. And I think more than and again, one of the things that's kind of a misconception is that the Swingville stuff's going to be all up tempo, and the Moodsville stuff's going to be all down tempo. And while they both have more of a, Moodsvilles are more ballad centric, there's still some up tempo, mid tempo stuff. And with the Swingsville stuff, there's still ballads, there's still mid tempo stuff, and a lot of these same artists appear on both. And I wouldn't even be surprised if a guy like Coleman Hawkins does a session and some of those tracks end up on a Moodsville, some end up on a Swingsville, and like they're very interchangeable. These aren't separate series as much as one would think. And I think there's a lot of misconception about. This is the Great Al Casey, one of my favorite recent discoveries on guitar. I bought this probably 6 months ago, maybe less even. If I remember, he played with Nat Cole for a long time. Or was it Fats Waller? He was Fats Waller, sorry. Just fantastic. And really enjoy his record on Moodsville as well. This makes it 2008. Swinging with Pee Wee Russell, flamboyant clarinetist, star of the Dixieland big band swing era. Just a great player with a ton of. You're gonna notice me when Pee Wee Russell plays. You're gonna hear him play. He's not gonna slip between the cracks. Pee Wee Russell is a bad boy. 2008, 2009. Yes, indeed, Claude Hopkins. Hopkins is a great piano player who goes back to the 20s, who had a big impact on a lot of guys with Emmett Berry and Buddy Tate. And again, fantastic album covers. They just all are part of that series. And then, like Moodsville, the covers change at 10. Oh, 2010's the last one. This is with Al Sears, Taft Jordan, the great trumpet player, and Hilton Jefferson. I don't even know who Hilton Jefferson is. This record's outstanding. My buddy Scott Baldwin was just talking about it the other day. Al Sears really plays, and it's one of these things where these covers are so similar that it can be difficult knowing which ones you got, which ones you don't. You know, I'm like, oh, I think I had. Well, it's a little bit tougher, and so I think it's a good thing they went away from that design here with 2011. And this is Jive at 5 with the Joe Newman Quintet featuring Frank West. And if you've watched this channel for any length of time, you know that Joe Newman and Frank West are Count Basie alumni, and that great Basie orchestra of the 60s, late 50s, into the 70s. And even into the 80s, the Basie Orchestra was one of the best in the world. My friend Jean-Michel Reisser has often talked about those great Basie bands in the 70s and 80s that were touring Europe and just how incredibly good they sounded. You know, he sent me some live recordings on CD of some stuff that he saw in person. And the band's just a machine. And it just makes you really appreciate the power of an organized, tight swing band. Nothing like it. Benny Goodman's Sing, Sing, Sing. That blows me away every time I hear it. Especially if it's any kind of loud setting. It's like, what the heck? This must have just changed the world when it came out. But Al Sears, a great player. I'm sorry, Joe Newman, a fantastic player. He makes a great string of solo records, which makes him somewhat kind of an anomaly here. Because a lot of the other guys, their only work they got in the 50s and 60s was the Prestige, Mooseville, or Swingville. Al Casey's a great example. Newman makes a lot of records for a lot of labels, from Corral to RCA. He's all over the place. He makes a lot of great stuff. Storyville. I love Joe Newman. I think he has a record that I just had him sit in my head. Vanguard. I love Joe Newman's stuff. And he's just one of those great players of the trumpet that's kind of not as bright as the Armstrongs and the Clifford Browns. And he's not as soft and milky as the Art Farmers, the Chet Bakers, the Miles Davis. He's one of those middle range guys, like a Kenny Dorham. Just gives you a nice tonality, clean punctuation, great enunciation. Bud Freeman, another great swing player with Shorty Baker. This is a OJC reissue of this, kind of on a flimsier. You can just feel the difference in the weight. That's 2012. I like Bud Freeman's record he makes also at Bethlehem. It's nice stuff. 1 second. So next in line here, we have Stash, the Prestige Blues Swingers featuring Coleman Hawkins. It's a cool cover. I actually like that cover quite a lot. This is number 2013. And this has quite a large ensemble of players on it. From Jerome Richardson to Pepper Adams to Idris Suleiman, Ray Bryant, Wendell Marshall, just some real great players of the modern era. And that's the other great thing about these series is you do see a lot of the younger cats grafting into the sound with the older cats. We're not coming back to you and playing swing, but the swing cats also aren't coming forward to play hard bop. We're kind of meeting in the middle and playing this, in some ways, what's the coolest of jazz sounds that there is. Because like I said, a lot of that West Coast cool is either really saccharine or it's really cool bop. It's hard driving. This right here is in a way some of the coolest sounding jazz in terms of its tonality, its mood, its temperature, how it makes you feel, where you'd put it in the film. It's not things are tenuous and falling apart. We're not jumping out of a helicopter to this. You know what I'm saying? But it's also not a dance party full at a nightclub like a swing, song might. It's melancholy. It's cool. It's cool. And I think the term cool is one of the most misused terms in the jazz kingdom for some reason. So much of what's supposed to be cool doesn't really fit the term and how I describe cool. This is Tate Buddy Tate with Clark Terry. Buddy Tate's another one of those great Texas tenormen, as I was saying. Just a great player in the school of Illinois Jacquet. Some Ben Webster in his sound as well. And then, of course, Clark Terry, who played with Ellington for a long time. I think he played with Basie, too. Clark Terry's from St. Louis. He's one of the great trumpet players that today's collectors are kind of ignoring. Terry stuff, aside from a few titles, doesn't fetch big money. His Riverside titles are great. His Impulse titles are great. Great modern post-bop stuff. His one record that does go for pretty good money is his Argo, because that was never reissued, and that's a pretty tough record to find that out on a limb on Argo from like 1957. Bud Johnson, another Texas Tenorman, 2015. I love Bud Johnson. I think this guy's somewhat a victim of his name. Bud Johnson's kind of an anonymous name. It sounds like he could be a plumber. You know what I mean? Your lumberjack neighbor, electrician Bud Johnson. You know, just the name seems kind of redundant and not flashy or showy. And so I think, even myself, I think I overlooked Bud Johnson for who's Bud Johnson. You know, but he's actually one of my favorite players. His work on Riverside's outstanding. His stuff here in Swingville, Moonsville, just outstanding. And again, he's one of those guys that doesn't get a lot of work past the swing era. It's word on for Bob Weinstock. Another Coleman Hawkins. This one had a different cover originally, if I think about it. 2016 Nighthawk. And this actually, Swingsville. This is a great album cover. Great record. And let's take a look at the assignment on this. Eddie Lockjaw Davis, bassy. Tommy Flanagan, one of the leaders of bebop and the hard bop movement. Ron Carter, a young up-and-coming new lion. Gus Johnson on the drums, a legend of the swing era on the drums. So that mixing of the different breeds, it's omnipresent. They're all working together, and these standards, these songs, it's a language that any generation speaks. You don't have to be fluent in bebop to play this. You don't have to be a swing giant to play. You don't have to go to the other side. It's that kind of meeting in the middle of songs that everybody loves. This is great. Buck Clayton and Buddy Tate. Again, just a great mix of some great giants from the swing era. And record after record, it's just this pared down Buddy Tate, Sir Charles Thompson on the piano, with a lot of great records on Vanguard. He's kind of a forgotten guy for Charles Thompson. Gene Ramey's on the bass, and Moosey Alexander's on the drums. I don't even know who that is. I've seen the name once or twice. Number 18, Al Sears, Swings the Thing. Again, it's that great tenor sound. Al Sears is one of those names you just don't really know about. He just kind of slips through the cracks. And here we've got Don Abney, Richardson, Wendell Marshall, and Joe Marshall. Still got his plastic sleeve on it too. It's fantastic. Feels like a nice heavy record. It's got to be a fairly old pressing. That's awesome. Al Sears, again, my friend Scott Baldwin was saying how much he loved Al Sears records. And I'll be honest, a couple of these I've only heard once or twice, because I've been kind of filling these in myself the last year, having overlooked them myself, you know. And now that I've kind of immersed myself into them, and some of them I've had a long time. The Coleman Hawkins, the bigger names, Greg Garland, I went and got those records a long time ago because of the artist. So certain records I buy by artist, certain records I buy by series. And as I got more into buying series, these were kind of two of the last series I really went out and really stretched my knowledge in. Joe Newman with the great Frank Foster. Again, both bassy alumni. Tape. The masking tape, that masking tape to me is more unappealing than the crack scene you covered up with it. Not sure I understand the logic of that. It's a preview promo copy with Tommy Flanagan, Eddie Jones, and Billy English, the great Chicago drummer. Eddie Jones, a bass player who played, I think, with Basie for quite a while. Joe Newman, again, you gotta love all of Joe Newman's work. And then number 20, Let's Jam, Claude Hopkins, the piano player once again, who you can see he's already a pretty old cat there. And with Buddy Tate and Joe Thomas. And Joe Thomas, I think, is a trumpet player. Yep, he is. With J.C. Hurd, the great drummer, and Wendell Marshall. And Wendell Marshall is a great bass player that records a lion's share of the early Savoy works. Not the stuff from the late 40s, okay? We're talking when Savoy 12,000 series launches. The first dozen or so titles are kind of back catalog that they're reissuing. When they start putting out new material about 12,010, 12,013, all the way through about 12,070, Wendell Marshall, Hank Jones, and Kenny Clark are the rhythm section on dozens and dozens of those records. Wendell Marshall is a giant. He played on so many great records. And then after he does the Savoy stuff, he comes over to Prestige, probably 59, 60, as Savoy starts kind of moving away from jazz to going towards gospel, and they have some experimental stuff. Wendell takes his talents to Prestige and does a lot of great recordings as a sideman at Prestige. If you look at Wendell Marshall's body of work, he's on so many great records. And yet he never made records as a leader, which means a lot of us kind of don't know about Wendell Marshall. That's the nature of this business. 2021, a record I just got recently with Shorty Baker and Doc Cheatham. They're both trumpet players from what I recall, indeed. I love Doc Cheatham. I know him from actually Ken Burns documentary. They interviewed him a couple times. Walter Bishop Jr., Wendell Marshall, and J.C. Hurd. So again, a very younger set rhythm section with these older cats in the studio. This is that Jimmy Hamilton record I don't have the cover for, 2022. It's called It's About Time. I was disappointed when it showed up. It didn't have the cover. Like I said, I didn't notice it didn't have it. I sometimes will print off a cover and make it look as close to the facsimile as possible, but I just intend to buy this again at some point. Of course, depending on my money and my financial situation. 2023, and like there's probably at least a half dozen titles in Prestige Mooseville and Prestige Swingville that had dual releases. This is one of them, Blue Stompin' House Singer with Charlie Shavers and Ray Bryant. And that should tell you a lot right there, because House Singer's a great rhythm and blues, just gutsy horn player, with Charlie Shavers, one of the great, fun Armstrong proteges that has a lot of personality, and he can embody anybody in his style. And then you add the great Ray Bryant on the piano, who also has a lot of rhythm and blues to his sound. This is Prestige 7153, and it's also Swingville 2023. Again, it's kind of confusing sometimes. 2024, things ain't what they used to be. Coleman Hawkins, a weird album cover. The cover's not great. They kind of make you pass it over, but it's got a lot of great players on it. Claude Hopkins, Buddy Tate, Jimmy Hamilton. This actually might even be a compilation from the looks of it. I think this is a compilation of previous release stuff. I'm just looking at the back of that. Coleman Hawkins years ago. And this also probably is like 2025, another compilation. It looks like those are both just kind of greatest hits of the Swingville era so far. 2026 is Cliff Jackson's Washboard Wanderer, and then Dick Wellstood's Wallrights. And this obviously has got some roots to it. When you got guys playing washboard, and it looks like one side for each. I'll be honest, I have not even heard this one yet. 2026. I got this in the mail last week and been so busy making cards I haven't played it. Joe Newman, Joe's Happening. I think this is his third record here. Again, fantastic Joe Newman. You gotta love him. Jimmy Hamilton, this is his second one, the great clarinetist from Ellington's group, 2028. Just one of those guys that you forget about until you hear him and you're like, oh man. And again, it's not swing in that sense. These are modern small jazz combinations. Grooving with Buddy Tate, again, more of the great Tenorman. Fantastic stuff. Nice weathered cover to give you some of that vintage feel. One of my favorites is Swingville 2030, Buck Clayton with Buddy and Tate, Buck and Buddy Blow the Blues. That's some great alliteration right there. Buck Clayton is one of the guys that actually does get some work post-swing era. He has a nice string of records at Columbia, and you can find those because of distribution reasons cheap. Buck Clayton on Columbia from the late 50s is great stuff, and he's just one of the great players of any era. Buck Clayton deserves a lot of memory. This is a Dixieland Sound Spectacular. A lot of guys from that ilk here reproducing that sound. Vic Dickinson, Leonard Gaskin, Edmund Hall, Doc Cheatham. You know, it's basically those kind of era cats reuniting and playing Dixieland Revival, which was also very popular at Riverside at this point. They were bringing about a whole bunch of Dixieland Revival groups, the Red Onion Band, Carl Halen's Gin, whatever it is. Those bands were fun, modern replicas of music that was now 20, 30 years past. So there's always a reference point that's kind of lost today. Benny, Ben, and Barney. And this has Ben Webster, Barney Bigger, and Benny Carter. And what a record this is. Ben, Benny, and Barney. Swingville number 2032. And again, some real giants are sitting right there. You gotta love Ben Webster, Shorty Chirac, Jimmy Rawls on piano, Leroy Vinegar, Mel Lewis on the drums. Just incredible. Benny Carter, Ben Webster, Barney Bigger. I'm not sure who that is on this end there. Well, it's gotta be probably Shorty Chirac, I'm gonna guess. I don't know who that is. Shorty Chirac, trumpet. Who's Shorty Chirac? Now one of y'all Google it and tell me. Darktown Strutter's Ball, Dixieland Sound Spectacular, more of Leonard Gaskin. And I think Leonard Gaskin's the bass player in these records. Again, it's more of the great guys from that swing era. Dickie Wells, Bud Freeman, Pee Wee Irvin, Herbie Hall. More New Orleans revival stuff. It's great stuff. And people don't often recognize that the Dixieland sound has a lot of the same tenets as free jazz. A lot of these cats are going different directions at the same time, playing simultaneously. It's actually kind of cacophonous at times. Just the disparate movements and sounds that are happening. It's very chaotic. It's like an urban intersection with a streetlight that's not working. Everyone's going 60 miles an hour. It can be very, very convoluted, and yet there's always a swing to it, which keeps it coming together back again, and it goes its own little ways, and it comes back together again. That's part of the magic of that sound. Henry Red Allen is one of those great forgotten players. He goes back to the 20s, if I remember. Again, I like that album cover quite a lot. Just a great player. Who's on this record? Frank Skeet, Jerry Potter, Lanny Scott. And Red Allen was a great trumpet player, like I said, who was on the cusp between the Dixieland and the big band era. And he was a pretty big giant in people's minds in the 30s and into the 40s. And he really is one of those guys that's really slipped into obscurity in the present. This is Blue Groove, Coleman Hawkins with Tiny Grimes and Ray Barretto, 2035. And I think this one might have a counterpart on the Prestige 7000 series. Basic Reunion, I'm sure this one has a counterpart. This is Paul Kinneshay, Buck Clayton, Chad Collins, Nat Pierce, Freddie Green, Eddie Jones, Joe Jones. These are all the Basieyites, getting re-together and blowing for Swingville's Prestige session. I love that record. There's a second one as well that's only in the Prestige series. Fantastic stuff. Paul Kinneshay is kind of giving the leadership on those. There's actually a third one on United Artists. I think it's called For Basie with a question mark or something like that. That's also in step with those two records. Dixieland Hits, Country and Western. Again, Leonard Gaskin with Benny Morton, City to Paris, Herbie Lavelle. More of that same Dixieland revival stuff. That's 2040. There's a few titles that are missing that are just collections again of stuff. And then this is Swing Time, Claude Hopkins with the great Bud Johnson and Vic Dickinson. And that rounds out Swingville. So I'm a big fan of Swingville, big fan of Moodville. They both have an elevated place in my mind now that I've gotten to know them better. And me and Scott Baldwin were talking this the other day, how they're some of the most underappreciated records in the canon. And you as a collector can have access to some of the greats for a great price, which is getting harder and harder to do in today's market. We talked about grading last episode, and we got some good feedback on that. Finding a good jazz record for a good price, that's a score nowadays. It's getting tougher and tougher just to do that. Prestige also had a Bluesville sequence, which I only have a half dozen titles of, maybe, if that. Eddie Lockjaw Davis showcases Al Smith, so Lockjaw's actually not on this. It's a very traditional blues setting. I have a few more in my blues in the other room, but so it just shows you how Weinstock, even though he wasn't famous for treating his black musicians very well, he certainly valued the commodity that was black music. And he delved into the old cats, the new cats, the modern cats, the blues cats. He was always, and like soul jazz, which was the most popular form of jazz in the mid to late 60s, Prestige is at the forefront of that. So Weinstock does deserve a tip of the cap always. So again, that's Smoothville and Swingville. Hope y'all enjoy that sequence. Buy them when you see them. They're getting rare. You know, these records used to go for even less than they do now, and they're going to start becoming more and more searchable as we move forward here, more collectible. These are names worth remembering, you know, bottom line. So my name's Dan, I'm the Jazz Shepherd, for those of you who don't know. If you want to support the channel, it's always appreciated. Go to Patreon in the description below, and if you do, you'll have access to some trading card downloads as we get further along in that process. If you want to go to the merchandise store and support by buying a t-shirt or a hoodie or a coffee mug, that's always appreciated. For those of you who don't know, I'm between DJ gigs right now. I lost my job for some kind of bullshit last 3 weeks ago, and I'm kind of tracking down a few things right now, but we're still kind of in the middle, so every penny helps right now. Appreciate your support if you can. There's also the great Jazz Shepherd podcast, which is growing slowly. We start putting some of the audio from these on the podcast so that people can, you know, drive around or do their walk listening to it. You lose some of the visual, but I'm not the most pretty thing to look at anyway, am I? So podcast is there if you want it. Again, appreciate everybody who's a part of this channel. Appreciate my friends like Scott Baldwin and Jean-Michel, Ken McAuliffe. You guys are all great, wonderful sounding boards and great support as well. And it means a lot to me that you all appreciate what I do, because I know I appreciate what you guys do. You know, Ken, how you bring a lot of the later stuff to light, and your writing and your hi-fi stuff. You're very knowledgeable about that, and I'm certainly not in that camp. I'm more knowledgeable about the music and the record collecting aspect of things, and I try to cover that side and not speak on things I don't know about. I don't talk a whole lot about gear because I don't know a lot about gear. I got a guy who picks up my needles for me. So that wraps up today's episode. Y'all be safe, stay warm. We got our first few snowflakes overnight last night, but they look like they've all dried up already. So winter holidays are on the way. Y'all be safe, be blessed, peace.